Well, good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here this afternoon, and we're really pleased and honored to have a leader in medicine in the country and the world today, and a leader in our government today, Dr. Rob Califf, who is Commissioner of the FDA. Rob was confirmed with an overwhelming vote of the Senate in February of this year. He had been at the FDA prior to becoming Commissioner. He was Deputy Commissioner for Medical Devices and Tobacco. And prior to that, he'd been Professor of Medicine and also the Vice Chancellor for Clinical and Translational Medicine at Duke. Rob and I go way back. I did my internship and junior residency in surgery at Duke when Rob was junior attending in cardiology. And I vividly remember rotations on the post-op cardiac surgery unit when the angioplasty revolution was beginning, and Rob was certainly one of the leaders in that. And those patients used to be hospitalized in the post-op heart unit after angioplasty. And the joke among the cardiac surgeons was, you know, this isn't going to last. They're going to burst the arteries, and they're just going to make more business for the heart surgeons. And of course, the rest is history. And I think even at that early stage, Rob was demonstrating his ability to think outside the box, to really be a pioneer in defining future paradigms, and to challenge all of us to challenge conventional wisdom and look for really how each of us individually and collectively can have the maximum impact in what we're doing. And during Rob's tenure at the FDA, both before becoming commissioner and now, he's championed a number of initiatives, and I think he'll be talking about some of those today. But in particular, Rob is looking for ways that the FDA can harness the tremendous amount of information embedded within the data that the FDA collects from so many different sources, and that today oftentimes sits in repositories and isn't really being mined for the type of information that could be gleaned from it. And that, of course, is very consistent with what we're trying to do here today at Stanford Medicine in defining really the role and the opportunities for precision health. That is how we determine, using genomics, using big data science, how we assess risk factors for disease and develop better interventions to prevent disease from developing or to diagnose it earlier and therefore treat it much more effectively. So today's Dean's Lecture is going to be a bit different in that Rob is not actually going to lecture. Instead, we're very honored that Bob Harrington, our professor and chair of medicine at Duke and a longstanding colleague, a professor and chair of medicine at Stanford and a longstanding colleague of Rob's from, no, you are staying and you are here. Bob Harrington, our professor and chair of medicine at Stanford and a longstanding colleague of Rob's from Duke, where they work together in forming the magnificent clinical research enterprise that is at Duke today. So Bob and Rob, please come on up.
God, I wasn't sure the old guy was not going to make it up the front, so I tried to lead him the other way. So thank you, Lloyd, and thanks to everybody for coming. This should be really fun. One of the things that we want to do is make this an audience participation. So I have several pages of questions. I've also known Dr. Califf, as Lloyd has suggested, a long time. And so the opportunity to ask him whatever's on my mind is always looked forward to. But we'd like to get you involved. As Lloyd has said, and in my conversations with the commissioner's staff, what we really want to talk about today is what's being called the knowledge reservoir from FDA. And we want to lead Rob through a series of questions really about how do we as a country, how do we as a society open up some of that data to make new insights, to learn new things about devices, diagnostics, therapeutics, drugs, biologics, et cetera, and what might be the process, what might be some of the methods by which we do that. Rob is also going to have a chance later today to meet on the same topic with a group of local corporate individuals, and so get a different perspective on the topic. So I think that this will be an important part of informing him as he thinks about these type of policy implications. Rob, before I kick it off, do you want to make any opening remarks or say anything to the group?
I'll try to stay brief because I think the most fun parts of these kind of visits are really the audience participation and getting ideas from you. But in brief, I'm sort of on a college tour, and this is the last stop. In case you didn't notice, there was recently an election, and I have a presidential appointment, which means as a pro forma exercise, I turn in my resignation, which I've done, and then it's up to the new president to decide who the FDA commissioner should be. But I really don't regard the FDA commissioner job as something that's like a limited issue. It's really a privilege on a national basis to get a very broad view of what's happening in this country and in about 20% of the economy. We've just done. We actually have 40 PhD economists at the FDA, something I didn't know until I got there. And they just published their latest estimate. In fact, we regulate about 20% of the economy. 11% of it is actually food. The other 9% is mostly biomedical. And of course, there's tobacco, which is a big issue for us that we've recently taken on. But one thing that I knew about, but I think within the FDA, there was not as much knowledge about as what's happened to the national enterprise of healthcare delivery, which is obvious. Just look at Stanford. Back when I was a UCSF house staff, we used to laugh about, Stanford had a few patients here and there, and it was on an ivory tower, and there were professors doing, deep science research, but clinically, a few good things. That was it. You now have a thriving health system that's growing and adding all sorts of things like everybody else. And in fact, if you look across the country, it's consolidating into a few hundred big systems, almost all of which have a medical school as a central component. And these enterprises are now beginning to spin off technology companies at a very fast rate that are in the spaces that we're regulating. And the old boundaries that used to exist, and here Stanford has obviously been a real leader going back a ways. The old boundaries between academia and business and industry are being broken down. And we need a strategy to deal with it. So I've been to a number of places over the last couple of months. This is the last stop, and I think for me, having spent time in San Francisco and the friendship with you, and Lloyd didn't even mention my younger brother and Lloyd were interns together. So I have some Lloyd stories I could tell later on, but I'm holding them in reserve. So I really look forward to exchanging ideas about what to do with a fundamental issue that I believe strongly in, and I think is very strongly believed throughout the FDA, which is that the big revolution in health and healthcare is really an information revolution. And we've gone from a time when we were struggling to get data to a time when everybody has data. Turning it into information and knowledge is a huge challenge. And it's a bigger challenge in medicine than almost any other area for a whole set of cultural reasons, not necessarily technological reasons. So we're trying to figure out how to unlock that situation within the FDA, but also in the ecosystem in which we live, where we know the big advances are likely to occur through wide-scale sharing of data, high-level analytics, much of which is just the way it's done in Silicon Valley for many other aspects of society. So I look forward to this sort of whole 2 days. And then capping it off on Friday, we got a meeting in Washington where we're bringing in 75 people of all the representative industries and power brokers and federal agencies and the private sector to talk about an evidence generation system for the country. What should it look like, and how should the parts fit together? So that's my story, and I really look forward to hearing what you all think about it.
So let me jump into it, Rob, and as way of background, because we have we have a fairly diverse audience here. Most people know that the FDA holds enormous amounts of data, but it's largely for individual product decision making. And that much of that data that's held for individual product decision making is regarding its ultimate commercial use. What people probably know is that you have data that extends from biomarker data to imaging data to clinical data to a very large very large populations worth of data. What they probably don't know are some of the statutory limitations around who has access to that data, who uses that data, et cetera. So let me maybe walk through some things so you can help the audience at least have a framework. Maybe the first is, can you give people some sense of the amount of data that's held by the FDA and what was termed by your staff as the knowledge reservoir? You know, you have regulatory decision making, you have all the files submitted by companies. How many products are in there? How many years of data? What about the storage? Is it all computerized? Is a lot of it in paper? I mean, give the audience a sense of what we're talking about here.
I'll try to keep from going for 3 hours here just on that topic. But we have mountains of data. It's disaggregated, not highly organized. There was an experience I had over a decade ago working with the FDA as a consultant on computerizing applications from companies, and the device industry held out staunchly that it was unfair to small mom and pop garage companies to demand computerized entry. So there's still stacks of paper, which you've seen in these applications that go in. But we also have a huge amount of computerized data from clinical trials. Unfortunately, not all collected with the same standards, but at least it's highly curated data. And we can talk a bit about the legal limitations. It's important for people to know it, but I'd like, for the purposes of today, for the most part, to just assume that laws can change, which they can, and that the mood of Congress is just reflected in the bill that we signed, that the President signed yesterday.
Why don't you tell people about that?
Cures bill. I'm just a country boy from South Carolina, but you know, going to a bill signing was a pretty amazing experience, and the Cures legislation was signed yesterday. I've got on this suit because I didn't get a chance to change. I've got my fancy White House suit on. This bill has a lot of innovation-friendly stuff in it. It started out maybe not so good from the FDA perspective, but it's really turned out to be a great bill for FDA. It instructs us to do things like think about how to do clinical trials better. It has a pathway for regenerative medicine with a funded NIH network that we have input to find out what actually works and what doesn't for things that people are doing. It tells us to work out the methods of real-world evidence so that we can use that in practice. And built into all this is a view of Republicans and Democrats that we got to get over the hoarding of data by health systems. There has to be interoperability built in, which is a loaded word that means a lot of different things. Many of you in the audience know more about it technically than I do. So it's an exciting time for innovation, and we need to take advantage of it.
So let's talk a little bit first about the statutory limitations. You and I were involved years ago when PDUFA included the pediatric exclusivity clause of actually sending some of our faculty members up to FDA to pore through all of that data. But there were huge limitations about what they could and could not do. Was that something exclusive to pediatrics, or does that possibility of getting across companies, across products exist in other diseases today?
So let me start by saying I think a major role for universities in today's society is to help society figure out what to do for what the rules should be about data sharing. Because, you know, we're starting from a place where there are a set of laws, and there's a thing called commercially confidential information, and they're trade secrets. And it's actually a crime for an FDA employee to reveal that information. We go to jail if we do it. So that's a kind of holds you up a little bit in terms of wanting to share too readily. But in addition to the law, there's decades of precedent set on interpretation of the law, both by courts and inside the FDA. And that can be changed if it makes sense to change it. But I think the main thing to know is that commercially confidential information and trade secrets, we by law can't reveal those. Those belong to companies. And then there's this major legal question that's actually never been tested that we used to talk about a lot, and it's really come into play with clinicaltrials.gov, where I'm quite proud we finalized the rule on that. And there are many things to work out yet. But the question is, to whom does the data from a human experiment belong? And as you know, the way I like to think about this is to ask the question, would you like to say out loud, we did a secret human experiment? I just don't think that really rings true as a good thing. So when people volunteer, when you get permission to do the experiment, you've signed an institutional agreement that you understand you're doing this to create generalizable knowledge. And if it's secret, it's hard to say it's creating generalizable knowledge. But who owns the data from clinical trials has actually never been legally tested, to my knowledge. But there's a tradition inside of FDA to say it belongs to the companies. And I'm not here to tell anyone what the answer is because I don't know it. But universities need to be thinking about these things because there's a lot at stake. Your next patient, we were talking about breast cancer upstairs. The fact that so much data is not available means that often we don't know what to do, and maybe the answer would be there if we could aggregate the information and look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, so let's stick on that topic, Rob, because one of the questions that will come up, I think, is are there examples that you've had come across your field of vision, in breast cancer is a good example, other cancers might be a good example, where you'd say, you know, if we could piece this together, if we could aggregate this together, there's a story to be told?
Well, I found my most useful tactic with Congress has been to use my mom, and I have total permission to do this. She's 89 years old. She's 9 years into multiple myeloma.
She was at the confirmation hearing.
She came to the confirmation hearing. She didn't like what Senator Sanders had to say about me, and she actually wrote him a note and put it in his mailbox to let him know that while in the chambers. But you know, the great thing for me at the FDA is she's had recurrence of, you know, severe multiple myeloma 4 times, and all 4 times it just so happened that a new drug got through the FDA and was available. And most recently, about 4 months ago, I got a call about hospice from her oncologist. It turned out that daratumumab had just been approved based on uncontrolled single-arm studies with a total of like 200 patients, and she's had a miraculous you know, recovery again. And, you know, she knows she won't live forever, and she's given me permission to talk about her. And so in that case, daratumumab turns out to be, you know, her plasma cell went from 60% in the marrow to something like 5 to 10%, and her anemia went away, and she's causing me trouble and complaining. So that's all good. But if you ask me, what do we know about 89-year-old people with multiple myeloma? Not much. How many people between 85 and 95 with multiple myeloma are seeing oncologists who are getting paid a lot of money to administer therapy in health systems that are making a lot of money off of oncology? But the data, and the data is being collected in computers, but where's it going? I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned about older people with cancer, but you could name any disease.
I was going to ask you, do you think, you know, when we talk about precision health, precision medicine, a lot of the default conversation falls to cancer. You know, you might imagine as a cardiologist, I push back and say, well, come on, it's not all about cancer. There's other things we're going to learn here. As you see, again, you see a large swath of data coming across FDA. Any examples outside of cancer that excite you that you say, geez, you know, this is something we should know?
Well, as you know, everything excites me. So, I mean, like I say, you name any disease, any medical problem.
Let's talk about diabetes for a minute, because you were involved before you went to FDA, and our medical grand rounds this morning was on cases from diabetes. What's staggering is now with the guidance document from 2008, there's literally, as you know, dozens of trials going on. But the ability to compare across trials and think about the indirect comparisons, think about what you know from one trial versus another, it's really hard to do in the current system.
Yeah, so an ecosystem that had a common framework for the collection of the data and then just simply did A-B or A-B-C-D-E comparisons. We still don't know which drugs to use. You know, we know metformin is a base. And now,
we know that based on a pretty limited evidence base.
Yeah, it's fair enough. We also know now, despite all of the critique of what some of us helped push through the outcome trials in diabetes, that some of them actually reduce mortality, and it's good. You'd like to know that about all chronically given therapies. So there's a tremendous amount to be learned, I think, from a common information framework. And it's easy to refer to cancer because so much is happening there, but the concept of basket trials and core protocols where you learn as you go along, I think is really, really critical. But let me also tell you, we met yesterday with advocacy groups for rare diseases. 5,000 rare genetic diseases with no treatment today in the U.S. Now, one individual health system cannot solve that problem, and the best way to solve it is to have a national system that finds, if there's 60 people with a particular kind of rare disease, you need all 60 to make progress. And it's another example where broad data collection can have a huge impact by making things possible that just couldn't have been done before.
So let me ask you, your comment there, Rob, just made me think of it. It was not something I had thought about previously. I was going to ask you. There is a rare disease network funded by NIH. You're both, NIH and FDA are both HHS agencies. What's the data sharing that exists between NIH and FDA? And is that a cultural blockade or is that a statutory blockade?
One of the things I had to learn about was there are actually lawyers who protect one federal agency from another. And we have to have MOUs. But just, one thing you wouldn't have thought about that relates back to the legal framework, if an FDA employee reveals a trade secret to an NIH employee, then reveals it publicly, the FDA employee goes to jail, not the NIH employee. That's the way the law is read. And so we're in the process now of developing a set of MOUs that allow for much broader sharing of information between NIH and FDA. But those have to have very specific lists of people who then sign agreements about confidentiality, much like you would between businesses. It's something I wouldn't have even considered would be necessary, but it's for real. And there's a lot at stake because what we're seeing, particularly with the rare genetic diseases, is the time from NIH grant to startup company and clinical trial, it's all compressed. And so we don't want naive NIH grantees doing things that you would sort of do academically, but you wouldn't think it would ever be scrutinized in a regulatory environment. We need to fix that because we're finding that if we have poorly validated biomarkers, for example, that end up in the regulatory pathway, we've got a real problem when it can't be reproduced. And we've had a couple of situations like that recently.
Well, let's detour into that area even a bit deeper. That you mentioned in your opening remarks about the clinicaltrials.gov legislation that I know that you've been a big part of and a big advocate for. It's interesting to note that the industry has figured this out, and almost all of the industry-sponsored clinical trials have made their way into the reporting structure. Not so for the NIH-supported trials, or even worse, for the university-supported clinical trials. You want to try to comment on that and see how this fits into this broad? Because we're pretty bad at information sharing.
Yeah, I mean, part of the college tour I'm doing is because I am concerned that the biggest hoarders of data now are integrated health systems. And it's a cultural thing. So part of it emanates from the history of the NIH, where the rugged individual was the object of admiration, and that is translated into many things that are great and some that are not so good. But in addition to that, now places like Stanford, are developing big health systems, and data is regarded as an asset to be protected. On the other hand, we know that to solve a lot of these problems, we've got to share the data, and we don't have a great way to do it. So clinicaltrials.gov to me is just an example where the history had been, why bother to share your trial results in a clunky federal system? You're doing it for your own narcissistic purposes, quote unquote. I love the word narcissism as it relates to academia. It's an interesting thing. And the answer is because you're doing human experiments, and you have an obligation socially to put the information out there. Well, then people said, well, there are a lot of bad clinical trials, and why should we have to put those out? They're not useful. My answer to that is if you do a bad human experiment, you probably should be forced to put your information out there so people learn not to do that again. And remember that NIH-funded clinical trials, a very high percentage never finish. Another high percentage finish and never get published. And out of those that get published, a very high percentage are only cited one time, meaning no one thought enough of it to even consider it in the context of knowledge generation that we need. So I think one of the great advantages of having now the law that says you not only must publish that you're doing a trial, you have to also submit your results within a year of completion of the primary endpoint, and you have to publish your protocol and your analysis plan, is that the sunlight will provide the kind of scrutiny that will get rid of the wasted resources that are going on of lousy studies. Janet Woodcock at FDA has this term SCT, which is called on small crappy trials.
Small crappy trials, yeah. We
We've
talk
got to get rid
about
of
those.
small crappy trials and focus all the energy on trials that really matter. So you can see how, at least in my view, you sort of fix one part of it and it begins to have an iterative effect on the rest of the system.
So I'm going to pause here and see if we've been going for about 25 minutes. If there are questions out in the audience, this question in the front, just hold on, a mic will come to you. And just if you could introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Elliot Crane. I'm in the departments of pediatrics and anesthesiology, so I'm interested in analgesic trials. And as I'm sure you're aware, 80% of drugs given to children are unlicensed by the FDA for that purpose. And there are no approved analgesics for babies under 6 months, and only one for those 6 months to 24 months, which is ibuprofen, which is a significant problem. The pharmaceutical industry, because of BCPA and the pediatric rule, are forced and to some extent incented to do pediatric trials, but I think looking back on the last decade, those have been unsuccessful in getting analgesic trials done with especially opioids and some other analgesics. What do we have to look forward to, in your view, to get drugs studied and approved for pediatric use?
Well, you may know, and Bob referred to this, that for a whole variety of reasons, mostly driven by the fact I have a daughter who had congenital heart disease who is doing extremely well thanks to great surgery at UCSF down the road when I was an intern. I've been very interested in pediatric therapeutics, and we were very involved in the pediatric rule of BPCA and PREA that, have moved us from, I think the number now is up to over 300 drugs that have changed labels because studies were finally done in children as a matter of law. But, it's only the beginning. And please don't misinterpret me on this, but I can't help it. I have more than ever come to appreciate the privileged position that you're in as physicians and academics. You get a lot of benefits like tax breaks and things, and a lot of status because of who you are. And I think you correctly identified that the industry is not going to fix this. The medical products industry is not going to fix it. The government is, I don't think in the near-term future, is going to be in a position to mandate much beyond what we have. So this really is, in my view, a professional matter. And I think the pediatricians of the world need to continue what they started, I think, and have done a great job with, but you're pointing out we need to go further, and as a professional responsibility, incorporate questioning and research into the practice so that the cost goes down. One of the big inhibitors to getting industry to do things is that the way trials are currently done is so expensive that there's no return on investment for these kinds of trials. So I think I'm going to throw it back at you and say banding together and making this happen as a matter of practice is critical. I would also add you need to be vociferous, because you may know every day I've had to live with opioids like a lot of others. And if you saw the occasion yesterday, I think it almost brings me to tears, actually. The president was in tears, but it started with a mother and father from West Virginia talking about their daughter having a sexual assault, using heroin, getting off of heroin, and then having an athletic injury. She was a long-distance runner, and having a doctor give her opioids for her athletic injury and then overdosing and dying. the result of that is that politicians have said no more opioids, and then no matter how much we say, there are actually children who have pain that need to be treated. We just need to figure out how to do it rationally. You guys have really got to speak up to get the political will for the studies to be done.
You sure can. Wait for the mic, though, so that other people can hear.
I've been involved with many trials, clinical trials that are sponsored by the pharmaceutical industries, and one of the problems that seems to exist that's an impediment to FDA approval of drugs are the obstacles to completing trials that are imposed by the FDA. So I'll give you one example. It's pretty clear to those of us who practice in this field that mu-opioid receptors, mu-opioid agonists are effective analgesics regardless of the age of the organism, or indeed oftentimes regardless of the organism. But the FDA continues to require not just safety and PK studies to approve an opioid analgesic in the pediatric age range, but they continue to want evidence of efficacy. While the evidence of efficacy is self-evident, at least to me, there are significant impediments to doing placebo-controlled pain trials in vulnerable subjects, such as children. So we're caught between a rock and a hard place. We're told we have to do placebo-controlled trials, and yet, the IRBs view those, and the Helsinki Accord views those as an unethical exercise in the pediatric age range. And I don't see scientifically why efficacy trials are required at all for certain kinds of drugs that are well recognized effective in adults.
I'm suppressing the need for a really good academic argument here because of my current role. And one of the great pleasures for me was running into Harry Greenberg on the way in this morning. So we had one of our old-fashioned back and forth, which I have to be careful about doing in my current role. So what I'd say is this. Number one, many drugs now get approved and have labels updated without a placebo control. Number two, just to be a little provocative, I would say you have to try harder. You have to convince the FDA. And in most cases, when a profession really strongly believes something and they're not on the take, and I don't mean that, most of the time people are not on the take, but sometimes there's money being made by the use of certain products, and that leads to bias. So when that's not the case, most of the time the profession will win out. And in this particular example, I would urge you to escalate the discussion, because I can tell you we are working on opioids every day. And if there's something that's impeding, critical knowledge about what to do with children, I think there are escalation avenues that are very available to you. So I'd urge you to use them. And I think you can win the argument. So I appreciate your concern.
If you could wait for them.
Oh, no.
Rob, very great remarks. As you probably know, a mutual friend, Brian Strom, recently published an op-ed piece in the New England Journal called "Is the Juice Worth the Squeeze?", which was an analysis of a very large database that, as I understood it, the pharmaceutical companies have made available for analytics of a lot of their drug trials. And the point of this article, which I had no way of validating, was that there had been almost no utilization of this trove over an introductory period of about 2 years. Do you have any concern that making all of this data available won't really move the needle, that people don't do a lot of secondary analysis?
The short answer is no, but the longer answer is, I think a lot of things need to sort of find their right place as you go through it. And I think part of what happened that led to this was a lot of contentiousness about pharmaceutical companies hiding critical findings. And I think what happened was that turned out not necessarily to be the case as much as people claim. And so people aren't thinking about the other kinds of questions that can be asked about things like natural history of the disease. We also have, by the way, and getting back to academia, an enormous shortage of qualified analysts to deal with complex data like this. And I think another element of it is the requirement for audit trails as part of the analysis took some of the crackpots out of the mix who didn't want to be outed for not necessarily doing honest analyses themselves. So I think in the long run, in almost every case I know, making good data available to more people is a social good. It will play out. And I also think another use that people aren't thinking about enough is what I said. Learning about what to do and what not to do in the trials that have already been done, I think can be very helpful for the future. So, but I think Brian's basic point is factual, that so far when just clinical trials have been made available, people haven't made great use of it.
I think there was a question up here, if we could bring the mic. And then when you're done, maybe pass it down the aisle to Mintu.
Hi, I'm a first-year postdoc, and I'm actually funded through a fellowship that's partially associated with the FDA. And one of the cool things that we learn in this position is that you partner with a specific division at the FDA, and you get to see some of how their decision-making happens and what the challenges are in the case of, what information do we need to make a decision about clinical trial data, or how do we vet biomarkers that are submitted with a new drug application. And I was just wondering if you could comment where the FDA is going, either internally or externally, with other academic partnerships about how to solve these types of problems with what is the right regulation. Like, do we always need a placebo trial? Is that something we'll do in-house, or is that something we'll work with a company or an institution?
I think the dominant view at the FDA is we exist in an ecosystem. In the good old days when doctors only had paper medical journals and sales reps to deal with, the FDA had an important obligation of suppressing inappropriate transmission of information. We still have that obligation by law, and we use it, but the information ecosystem is basically the internet. It's all out there. And so the way to make progress is really to have all sectors come together in multi-sectoral problem-solving mode. And there's no question that a little bit of money can grease the skids. Like, it's amazing what's happened. It's called the CIRSE program, where we have a limited number of institutions that we have funding to. A little bit of money seems to stimulate a lot of activity in bringing in other sectors. So I'd say we're wide open. Again, another role for universities that gets into the sort of legal component is our dual role is complicated, because our mission says we're here to protect the public, and it says we're here to promote innovation. And when it comes to protecting the public, we have to make decisions that need to be free of bias. We need to be seen as full-time government employees who are acting, our shareholders are the 320 million Americans, not any particular sector. And if we're interacting a lot with people in a more academic mode and problem-solving mode in general and innovation mode, then it's hard to stay objective, and it's easy to be accused of having been biased by those interactions. So we need a lot of help in figuring out the rules of the road in this new global and information-dense environment that we're in. But the short answer is people at FDA love interactions with academics and with anyone who has a good idea, and we would encourage more of it.
So Rob, let me build upon that question and maybe tie it back to Harry's. You and I talk a lot about the kind of partnerships that can exist. Give the audience a sense of, you say a little bit of money, sort of the scope of what the FDA has designated in that innovation partnership realm. And then, as you know, when I talk with you in public, I always give you a chance to give the FDA Jobs Pitch. I'm looking out and see all these young people here. So why don't you do both of those? Because you do create a story about the opportunity for innovation within the FDA.
Yeah, so I'd look at it in spheres. I mean, we have about a $5 billion a year budget in total. To regulate effectively in today's environment, much of it needs to be standards and principles based, not one product at a time based. So there's a lot just in the day-to-day interactions where we can always do better, but there's a lot to be gained by the interaction. We have a very limited amount of research funding. We're not fundamentally a research agency, and Congress is very aware of that. And so we're not going to get a lot of research dollars. But we look at it pretty carefully. You know, for example, we just put out a series of grants for natural history studies in rare diseases. And, you know, there are 5 of them, and there are 5,000 rare diseases. So, but it will stimulate activity, and other people will come into that sphere and help out, because we need natural history studies to then do the clinical trials with a good base of knowledge to begin with about the diseases. But then the thing that's really the gem that I have really enjoyed is our interactions with other federal agencies are substantial. And, you know, NIH is doing a lot of things very close. We have a joint leadership council with NIH. We meet once a quarter. We identify key areas, and there's a lot of responsiveness by NIH in terms of the problems that we need to have solved. The new clinical trials directive is a lot related to joint thinking about what the country needs. And then, you know, we just finished our user fee agreement negotiations for the medical products. It still has to be considered by Congress, and they, you know, have to pass a law to enact them. So it's not totally done. But built into those user fees is not just fee for service at the FDA, which is review the applications on timelines. But we identified with industry a number of topics like patient-centered outcomes, clinical trial design, real-world evidence, that are built into the user fees with industry support to do research. So that's another big opportunity. And in that, because of the user fee agreements and the industries are doing quite well, we have additional jobs. So we're hiring. If you love to look at data and you want to see everything in technology that's being developed, we have jobs at the FDA. So, and also in the Cures Act, we got a pay raise and an opportunity for special considerations for high-end scientists, because everyone recognizes that, for example, I was at Jackson Labs 3 weeks ago, and this company said, you know, we're developing nutritional products based on the interaction of the human genome, the microbiome, and the food that you eat. How are you going to regulate that? And I said, okay, we got what you eat, the genome, and the microbiome. This is not something that someone just sitting at a desk is going to be able to figure out. You know, it's a massive amount of data, and it needs to be interpreted. So, you know, we're looking for people, even if it's for a few years. I would submit that where translational science is headed, if you spend a couple of years at FDA, you'd be in a great position to do just any number of things afterwards.
Great, thank you. He'll be taking applications in the back at the end. But Mintu, go ahead.
Thanks, Bob. Dr. Califf, thanks so much for coming. I am a cardiologist and a health services researcher, and I also work on trials. And my question is about something that you touched on, which is the cost of trials, particularly those of pivotal studies for drugs and devices. Much of that cost is sort of with the usual trial infrastructure, site management, getting patients, ascertaining outcomes. And we're seeing, at least in the non-pivotal realm, a cottage industry of digital health, CROs even, to try to get patients directly, disintermediate sites, explore patient-reported outcomes. And while those still need to be tested in a more rigorous framework for kind of the things that matter for regulation, I'm wondering how do you see the conduct of trials evolving, particularly for pivotal studies, and what do you think might need to happen on the regulation side to facilitate lower cost trials and more rapid timelines?
All right, so I'll try to make 3 brief points, although I could talk for 10 hours about this, and we will on Friday. So stay tuned for the proceedings of that meeting. First of all, what's called a pivotal trial is being redefined as we speak, because we're increasingly recognizing that, it's obvious, knowledge about a medical product is iterative, right? You learn over time, it's continuous. The discreteness of it is you have to make decisions at certain points about what goes on the market, and investors have to make decisions about what gets invested in compared to other options. And so in devices particularly, it's much more of a continuum than it is with pure pharmaceuticals, and biologics are somewhere in between. It has to do with how much you can tweak. Second point is we are wide open to accept digital data of all types, and We all agree that we don't know exactly what to do with it because we want to be assured of the quality of the data. And that's a lot of work that needs to go on, but we're open to it. And a point that was made to me just this week by a consulting company that has its tentacles into every medical products company and every academic center at the same time. There are a few of those, so you can guess it's one of a handful that you would know of. You know, they made this point. They said decisions about investments are made on 5 to 10 year horizons. And so it's understandable that a company would not want to be taking the risk of using unvalidated data methods for what you described as a pivotal trial. So accepting that, the place to work at this right now is in the tremendous amount that needs to be done with different kinds of trials pre-market and then the vast knowledge reservoir after products are on the market. And that's a place to focus. But the big deal to me is we've got to fix the fundamental problem, which is that we have this, let's just take America. Every American has an electronic health record. We already can look at all the claims essentially, and every prescription dispensed is part of an electronic system that the FDA has access to, and anyone else can. And yet for traditional clinical trials, we have this parallel universe of data collection that's enormously expensive because no one trusts what you guys are collecting in clinical practice to be accurate. Dr. Harrington himself said the estimate that we heard upstairs that 12% of medical record data is incorrect. He said he thought that was an underestimate, and I don't know if you want to stand by that in front of you.
No, I'll stand in front of it.
Okay, you're a Department of Medicine chair. But, you know, every other industry in the U.S. Has gotten more efficient because it takes advantage of digital data and doesn't collect it another time in a more expensive way. That's the fundamental problem we got to fix. And the people in control of that situation are the integrated health systems with their academic centers in the middle. We used to rely on 6,000 or so clinical research sites that were all independent. They all needed a separate contract, a separate IRB. NIH Clinical Trials Directive says central IRBs are good, and let's get a common contract. Why are we fighting over who writes the best contract? It's ridiculous. Then the cost of these trials can come way down, and there's a lot of room to do more. And the more digital data you collect directly from patients, the less you have to have people come back for expensive clinic visits. So this is a time to revolutionize the system, but we're very dependent on you because you own the fundamental unit, which is the health system in which the care is being delivered and the data are being generated.
Steve? We could give Dr. Goodman the microphone there.
Thanks. I'm Steve Goodman in medicine and epidemiology. So I have two questions. The first relates to and I don't know what you can comment on in your current role. You described the Cures Act as a fantastic step forward. And of course, the phrase real-world evidence is complicated because they've defined it as anything not from a clinical trial, not even a clinical trial done in the real world. So it suggests that all clinical trials are unreal-world evidence or something other than what we thought they were before. So I guess the question is, how do you, a lot of folks see this as the camel's nose under the tent, that is allowing a lot of much less reliable evidence to be used as proof, which can be a huge asset, as was evidenced by the comment before about the opioids, if used correctly, and can be a Trojan horse if used incorrectly. So how do you see the FDA going forward, or what should we be watching for to make sure that this balance is struck the right way? That is, we're able to use less controlled or observational evidence in the way that informs that we believe is informative, while not allowing incredibly misleading evidence to make its way into the regulatory process.
Well, I would urge you to read the sentences if you really, I mean, I know you are personally read the sentences and the words very carefully in that law. And then then read the whole paragraph. What the paragraph says is the FDA is instructed over the course of several years to work out the rules that should exist for dealing with real-world evidence. And it did have a phrase in there about not clinical trials, but read the surrounding sentences, you'll see some things there. I'll just put it that way. And then go to New England Journal last week, where we put out the FDA point of view in some detail. And basically it's this. In our view, you have two dimensions, and people have tended to say it's randomization or real-world evidence, two ends of opposing perspectives. It really is two dimensions. One dimension, in our view, is where does the data come from? And it can either come from clinical practice or home or a wearable device or a separate research clinic separated from, quote, the real world. And the other is what's your experimental method, and that could be observational, could be individual patient randomization, could be cluster randomization, et cetera. And we say in the article, we think the highest form of the art is going to be randomization within the real world, which, by the way, is what industry does every day right now in routine business. So I think the proper interpretation of the law gives us the responsibility, working with you, to come up with a set of rules that allow us to take advantage of the data sources, which increasingly we think should be real world in the sense of digital, from electronic health records, directly from patient devices, et cetera. But then what are the experimental methods applied to that, and how do you do it? We've got room to do that built into the law.
So I'm told that we have time for one more question from the audience, because I want to give Dr. Califf a chance to give any wrap-up comments. So go ahead, Paul.
Oh, this is scary.
I'm Paul Auerbach from the emergency department. So Rob, you have opinions about things, and you should have opinions about things. How are you going to guide the FDA towards the issues that you believe should be investigated? So for instance, if concussions are important and you're sitting on data that have been collected over years from people that have tried to come up with devices to diagnose concussions, will you pick important issues and try and promote those to be investigated in this overall new scheme of thinking? And if so, what's important to you?
My problem is I find every human problem to be interesting, and I think you probably went to emergency medicine because you're drawn to that way of thinking also. So I focus less on individual topics and more on methods, I would say. And there's an interesting element that has, as an old ICU director, nothing keeps me up at night, so I sleep fine. But if I was going to stay up at night, it would be about this. It's really clear now that, at least to me, where science is, almost everything is possible because we're unraveling the genome. But as Harry made the point today, we're also unraveling things like your longevity related to how much money you make and the influence of where you live on access to resources and how they're used, et cetera. So we're in the world of these amazing possibilities. And then you say, what is it that causes us to make tremendous progress in cancer but no progress in Alzheimer's? Or why do some rare genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, have just tremendous progress and others there's nothing happening? And I think it's a result of an ecosystem, which includes, obviously at the beginning, is there science moving in that direction? But as I say, I think now science is much more pluripotent than it was. At the other end, you have patient advocacy, which has an enormous impact, and it's going to grow. So I would hate to have a disease that had a poor patient advocacy effort. And it's very visible to me. Why does cystic fibrosis do so well? One is we understand a lot more about the genetics of cystic fibrosis, but the CF Foundation is highly organized. Majority of people with CF are in one database. They demand that practitioners submit their data for quality purposes. They've donated their data to all scientists who can meet qualifications, and they ante up their specimens, and they invest in ideas. Other diseases that don't do that don't move as fast. It's not a surprise. And so, and then we have things that don't have a constituency, like we were right with the rare diseases yesterday. We had infectious disease. And certain parts of infectious disease have good advocacy, but sepsis is a terrible problem. There's not a big sepsis advocacy organization because people of all diseases end up with sepsis at some point. And concussion and trauma, there's a growing advocacy, increasingly effective, called veterans and interest in veterans. And I think that is an emphasis. But I think a key element of it, in order for success, you got to have sort of end-to-end emphasis. The basic science, the translation, a regulatory, and I think the point about pediatrics, I'm not discounting what was said, but it's obvious that the behavior of the FDA review groups has a big impact on where people are willing to invest. And the advocacy groups who make it easier or harder to get things done in terms of the clinical trials and implementation. So I really think we need to think about this seriously because much like Harry's got me obsessed with this article from your Economist now, which I had read but not paid attention to. It just makes a case that how much money you make is a huge determinant of a 23-year difference in life expectancy from top to bottom. But in the same sense, whether your disease ends up with an effective treatment may be dependent on how well organized your advocacy is. And for a public health agency, what is our responsibility to look after the areas that don't have great advocacy? And as a university, what can you do to give everybody a fair shake, which I think is a mandate?
So, Rob, I'm going to give you a chance to make any final comments to the crowd, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Well, you can tell I'm pretty fired up. I may not be at the FDA after January 20th, but I sure feel like I've learned a lot and had a chance to see things that are hard to see from any other perch. And I would just say that this is a pretty amazing time in society where the key to unlocking things, I think, is in the hands of young people who are facile with dealing with information. And there's a great imperative that you think about access and societal equality. And I'll sort of maybe close it with two experiences. One from my visit here a few years ago, where your guys in your Department of Medicine, when you were starting, made the point to me that here in one of the wealthiest places in the world, you have like 25% of kids who come to school and don't have shoes. And there's got to be a better way to deal with that than we're doing in the United States today. I'm not telling you I know what it is, but it needs to be on people's minds every day, because I do think that unless we solve some of the inequalities as they're getting wider and wider with these huge effects on how long you live, and if you look at opioid overdoses, another example, I spent a lot of time in Appalachia this past 2 years because of it. It's dispersed across society, but it's clear to see where the big problems are in our society. We've got to deal with it. But the technology is so clear, and this may not seem related at all, but it was fascinating to me. I was meeting with our contracts group at the FDA. I know, contracts groups are not loved.
Better than university
Not loved
contracts?
anywhere, right? But, contracts groups have a vital function. They sure do in the FDA, because to work with people outside, we have to have a contract. That's a legal basis. And I was asking, what can we do to help you? And they said, you got to get the old people to figure out how to use technology. And I said, you mean like, I know they don't know R, and they're still using SAS and stuff like that, but no, they said, we're talking about Microsoft Office. They said, we still have people who are used to sheets of paper, and we can't get things done in a complex organization. Can we pair up young people to mentor the older people? But technology is the key, and it can be used for either really good purposes, or it can be devastatingly bad if it's only used to exacerbate the inequalities that we currently have. So you're at a great place that can make a big difference in that. So I hope some of you will come to work at the FDA and help us with that.
So, Rob, thank you for including Stanford as your the last stop on your college tour. On behalf of Stanford Medicine, thanks for visiting us, and enjoy the rest of your visit.
Thanks a lot.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.